Hello again, and welcome back. Hopefully everyone is enjoying Endwalker, and if you're not at Endwalker when viewing this video, I still hope you're enjoying your time in Final Fantasy XIV. As stated in the last video, Endwalker features a ton of Final Fantasy IV references. Final Fantasy IV was also the first Final Fantasy I was ever exposed to, so it holds a special place in my heart. With that being said, this is Final Fantasy IV references in Final Fantasy XIV. Before we get started, this is your spoiler warning, as there are a ton of spoilers for both Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy XIV. Especially spoilers for Endwalker, as Final Fantasy IV served as an inspiration for Endwalker. I will try to keep all Endwalker story references at the second half of this video. Final Fantasy IV was first released in July 1991 for the Super Famicom system in Japan. The game was then released later that same year in North America under the name Final Fantasy II. The game features a cast of characters, all of which have predetermined jobs. One of these characters, Kain Highwind, is featured on the game's official logo. The logo was done by none other than Yoshitaka Amano. This now iconic pose for the Dragoon is featured heavily within Final Fantasy XIV, such as the promotional art for Final Fantasy XIV, the idle pose for male Dragoons, within the Heavensward opening video, and during the fight against Nidhogg in the Final Steps of Faith. Kain's armor is also in Final Fantasy XIV in the form of a Realm Reborn artifact armor. This armor is obtainable starting at level 45 through the main story quests. There is also the blue item level 90 artifact armor, which resembles closely to Kain's 3D remake color. And while we're on gear sets, the next gear set obtainable is the Tantra set in Heavensward. This set is based off of Yang's outfit. This set can be obtained in Ishgard using Centurio seals. There is also the Baron earrings and circlet, which are both based off of Cecil's armor. These were obtained by pre-ordering Heavensward. Baron is also the name of the town that Cecil lives in. And finally, we have the Dark Knight Cecil's helm, which is obtained by purchasing the collector's edition of Heavensward. These next sets are all obtainable in Endwalker. These sets are available through the Tombstone vendor at Radzenhan. The first set is the Tank set, which is based off of Paladin Cecil's armor. We also have the Maiming set, which is based off of Dark Knight Cecil's armor. Next, we have the Scouting set, which is based off of Edge's outfit. The Striking set is just a recolor of the Scouting set. Next, we have the Aiming set, which is based off of Edward's outfit. The Casting set is based off of Rydia's outfit. And finally, the Healing set, which is based off of Rose's outfit. Next, we'll be looking at the minions. There are several that are references to Final Fantasy IV. We have the wind-up versions of Kain, Porom, Palom, Rydia, Rosa, and Edge. We also have Naming Way as well. Wind-up Kain is obtained by purchasing the collector's edition of Heavensward. Palom was obtained by pre-ordering Endwalker, and Porom is obtained by purchasing the collector's edition of Endwalker. When Palom and Porom meet, they perform an action that is a reference to when they save the party by casting Break on themselves to stop walls from crushing the party. Rosa, Rydia, and Edge can be purchased on the Mog Station, and Naming Way came with purchasing the Encyclopedia Eorzea. And finally, there is a mount that is a reference to Final Fantasy IV. This is the Lunar Whale. This mount was available after the 2021 Virtual Fan Fest and is the only mount that can fit 8 people. This mount can be purchased through the Mog Station, and it comes with an orchestrated version of the Lunar Whale theme from Final Fantasy IV. And now, let's get to the gameplay and content. We can't have a reference video without one of the most iconic lines in Final Fantasy history. In the level 40 quest for Bard, Jen Hattel says, "Call me a spoony bard, but," which is a throwback to the original line from Tella, who calls Edward a spoony bard. Speaking of spoony bards, we have the Artemis Bow, the level 50 relic weapon that was originally created for a man named Gilbert a long time ago. Gilbert is the Japanese name for Edward, who is a bard in Final Fantasy IV. The Black Chocobo is obtainable after you complete a certain quest in Heavensward. This Chocobo is a reference to the Black Chocobo you use in Final Fantasy IV. In Final Fantasy IV, this is the only Chocobo with the ability to fly. In Final Fantasy XIV, this Chocobo is given to you in Heavensward, when flying was introduced back in 2015 with this expansion. And in Shadowbringers, there is a town of dwarves called Tamra. This town also appears in Final Fantasy IV, in which their dwarves also live. One of the dwarves in Tamra is named Giot. This name comes directly from the king of the dwarves, Giot. In the level 50 Dark Knight quest, you face off against a darker version of yourself. This is an allusion to when Cecil had to face off against his darker self in order to overcome it and become a paladin. And staying in line with Dark Knight, the ability Flood of Shadow is an AoE ability that consumes MP. The stance is very similar to the sprite of Dark Knight Cecil when he uses Darkness. In the original version, Darkness is an AoE ability that consumes HP. Next, in A Realm Reborn, the Demon Wall makes an appearance in Amdapor Keep. In tradition with the Demon Wall, this boss moves up periodically, much like the original game, until there is no more room. ADS in the Binding Coils of Bahamut are a reference to the CPU boss. In Turn 2, there are several CPU nodes that can help the final CPU if they are not destroyed. In Pharos Sirius Hard, the final boss of the dungeon is Progenitrix. This boss is based off the Mom Bomb in Final Fantasy IV. In fact, the Japanese name for this boss in Final Fantasy XIV translates to the Mom Bomb. Very much like the original game, she will spawn smaller bombs as well. Following the Progenitrix comes the Progenitor, which is a boss that is based off the Dad Bomb in Final Fantasy IV Interlude. Again, the Japanese name in Final Fantasy XIV is translated to Dad Bomb. In Stormblood, the final boss of the dungeon, the Burn, is the Mist Dragon. This is a reference to the Mist Dragon that appears at the start of Final Fantasy IV. The Mist Dragon can disappear much like the original game and become untargetable for a time. And in the final dungeon of Shadowbringers, Peglathon, the final boss is Lunar Bahamut. In Final Fantasy IV, Bahamut is found on the moon and is only when you defeat him you are able to summon him. Alternatively, this reference could also be towards the Lunar Bahamut secret boss as well. This version of Bahamut can only be fought in the Game Boy Advance and the complete version of Final Fantasy IV. In Antitower, Calcabrina makes an appearance as the last boss. They start out as their smaller doll forms of Calca and Brina before reuniting to form Calcabrina. This is very much like the original fight against Calcabrina in Final Fantasy IV. The music of the boss starts with the theme that was also used in the original fight of Final Fantasy IV. And now to the Endwalker content. If you made it this far in the video, I thank you. This will be another spoiler alert in case you want to skip this for now. But without further ado, here we go. The first dungeon of Endwalker is the Tower of Zot. This dungeon features music that was reorchestrated from the original Tower of Zot in Final Fantasy IV for Final Fantasy XIV. In this dungeon, you are tasked to save Nidhana and the people that the tower has kidnapped, much like how the party in Final Fantasy IV is tasked to save Rosa. In this dungeon, you meet the Magus Sisters. The names of each sister is based off of the original Magus Sisters in Final Fantasy IV, Mindy, Sandy, and Cindy. In the final boss, you face off against all three sisters. They use nearly the same strat they used in Final Fantasy IV. They use a ton of magic, they use Reflect on Cindy, and even use Delta Attack much like the original game. The strat of killing Cindy first is very much the same in Final Fantasy IV, as if you kill the other sisters first, Cindy will raise them. Some of the effects on the bosses, such as on Sandy and Mindy, are effects that are inspired by the black and white magic casting effects in Final Fantasy IV as well. In Garlemald, there is a region named the Eblan Rhine. Eblan is a town in Final Fantasy IV in which Edge and his family live. In Final Fantasy IV, Eblan was also near the Tower of Babel. Fittingly, the tower in Garlemald is also known as the Tower of Babel. In the tower, the first two bosses are Barnabas and Dr. Luger. These bosses are references to the characters of the same name in Final Fantasy IV. Hilariously enough, Barnabas will also attack Luger first, much like the original game. And now, to the moon. The entirety of the Mare Lamentorium area is a reference to Final Fantasy IV, in which that was the first time in Final Fantasy history that we step foot on the moon. When we first visit the moon, we are greeted to the figure named the Watcher. His responsibility is to oversee the imprisonment of Zodiark. The Watcher is a possible reference to Fusoya, in which he was responsible for keeping Zeramis away from the Earth. Next, this area is where we meet the Loporrits, a bunny race that lives on the moon. The Loporrits are heavily inspired by the Hummingways, a race of bunnies that live on the moon in Final Fantasy IV. Speaking to some of the Loporrits, they even play a jingle that is found in Final Fantasy IV. The area theme for the Loporrits is the Final Fantasy XIV's version of Welcome to Our Town. The battle theme of this area is the Battle Theme 1 from Final Fantasy IV, directly from the NES version. And finally, the entrance to Smileton features a face on the moon, which is a reference to the face on the moon that appears in Final Fantasy IV, in which that is a reference to a real-life photo of the face on Mars. I just thought it'd be cool to add a reference on a reference. At the end of the universe, when despair and destruction surrounds you, years of sorrow and destruction, when the last of your strength is spent, when all hope is lost. You hear the words of your friend's prayer. They give you what strength they have left to carry on. To ensure a brighter future for all of humanity. The prayers of hope surges within you. This moment is an entire allusion to the final fight of Final Fantasy IV, in which Zeramis takes your party to the brink of death, and when all hope seems lost, the friends you made on your journey also pray for you and give you strength to fight Zeramis once more. Much like the fight with the Endsinger, you hear the words of each of your friends as they give you the strength to carry on. And there we have it. As I said before, Final Fantasy IV was one of my first exposures to the Final Fantasy series, and I'm glad that Endwalker focused a lot on cool references to the game I started with. A huge shout out to my free company for helping me get some of this footage and helping me find some references. Anyway, as always, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing. It will always be appreciated. And in the next video, we'll be looking at the world of Final Fantasy V.